All right, welcome everyone. Really excited about this. My name is Tilek. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Outtalent. At Outtalent, we help software engineers from emerging markets get jobs abroad at companies like Google. And our mission is to help people from all countries set and achieve ambitious career goals. And today I'm really excited to host my good friend Olya. Olya Irzak is a founder and CEO of Frost Methane Labs. It's a company that aims to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by detecting, characterizing, and mitigating concentrated methane releases around the world. I met Olya when we both worked at Google X, which is sometimes called Google's Moonshot Factory. At Google and Google X, she was known to many as one of the experts in the topics that relate to carbon emissions reduction in the broadest sense. For example, grid, agriculture, transportation, non-electrified industrial processes, natural emissions, and a lot of miscellaneous topics related to that. And one thing that cracked me up is she had a fun title of instead of being an engineer, she was an Energineer. And I think her story is really very interesting. She has this also an immigrant story of herself, and her business I think is really fascinating. It combines, being a business and being funded by some of the top venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, like Chris Sacca, as well as doing good for the planet and for all of us, and also funded by some really amazing people and organizations such as Mulago, and she's gonna talk about it later, hopefully as well. And I just think Olya is an incredibly interesting person to talk to. I have a lot of topics to cover. Without further ado, welcome, Olya.
Thanks, Tilek. I don't know if I deserve the praise, but I'll take it.
You deserve. All right. So let's start in chronological order. Please tell us where you were born and where you were growing up.
Yeah. So I was born in, I guess at the time, Leningrad, and now St. Petersburg, and still the Soviet Union. Dating myself. And then we moved to Israel with the big emigration at the kind of end of the Soviet Union, spent there 6 years, and then moved to Canada for kind of mid-high school.
Cool. And how old were you when you moved first out of Russia?
7.
Okay, cool. So you still have some memories from Russia?
Yeah. Surprising amount. Whenever you make a change, I think it triggers memories for me in general, or triggers to remember. So there's both that, and in Canada we actually moved to an incredibly Russian neighborhood. So I think like 80% of my school was Russian speaking. My English didn't get good until like 3 years in. So kind of much like there's Chinatown almost anywhere in the world, Toronto has ethnic neighborhoods. In a very similar manner, but just for a lot more ethnicities, just because there was a really open immigration policy for quite a long time. And so around that time, you really had concentrated immigrant groups, which was awesome for my grandparents because they could be independent for much longer than they would have been otherwise.
Oh, that's wonderful. And one thing that really impressed me when I got to know you is your English was really fluent, because usually even when people move when they're like 12-year-old or 11-year-old, a lot of the people I know, they pretty much forget Russian or, not very comfortable speaking Russian. And you were actually more excited speaking Russian, which is really cool. And I mean, your English is it's not your first language probably. And I was very curious. It was like for me, it was already quite unusual that you managed to preserve your Russian fluency. That's because you also talked to your parents in Russian as well?
Yeah, my parents and my grandparents was always in Russian. With my brother, we speak in Hebrew to preserve the language, because a lot of the people that had that path forget the middle language. So kind of definitely get a little bit of practice. But I think the having always had the opportunity to practice with various peers has been part of what preserved it.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting path. I met a few people actually in Silicon Valley and San Francisco who migrated from like Soviet Union to Israel to Canada and then to San Francisco Bay Area. It's such a long path, and So do you wanna tell a little bit more about why this happens? I mean, I think one reason is some countries are just more open for immigration.
Yeah, exactly. And for so the path from Russia to Israel was for anybody with Jewish heritage a reasonably common one. Um, it was a faster immigration path than almost anything else in the early 90s. And so, there was kind of we really did intend to like stay, indefinitely, but about 20%, like Israel increased its size by about 20% in 1 year. So you can imagine what that does to a population. Let me tell you, any country that thinks it allows immigrants in has something to learn from Israel in the 90s. So you can imagine that was like really, really crazy, right? Like prices of real estate went through the roof. Salaries were quite low for the incoming population, and so it was very difficult to like make ends meet compared to like how easy it is in Canada and the US. Um, and so after a while, it seemed like both from like there wasn't such a good cultural click, and it was just incredibly difficult to break even every month. We moved to Canada, where that's that's just it's a very immigrant society, right? It's easy to belong pretty quickly compared to how it was in Israel.
Do you think it's about the same in different cities in Canada to belong?
That's a great question. I really have no idea. I can only speak about Toronto and to a smaller extent Waterloo and Vancouver. But Toronto was definitely incredibly welcoming.
That's great to hear. And I want to ask about software engineering. Like when did you try it for the first time, and when did you start liking it? How did it happen?
I think in high school mostly. Like my parents are both technical, and so they were encouraging me earlier than high school. But I think for me it was really around like I don't know, maybe 16. And it was the pretty typical experience that you can imagine, where the kids typically know more about computers than the teachers. Um, and so I can't say that my high school experience was representative. It was cool. It was like puzzles. So it was cool and fun, but it wasn't what it actually ended up being in university. So the reason that I picked computer science is there was a great co-op program. So it's a thing where 4 months you study, 4 months you work, 4 months you study, 4 months you work. So there was a university at the University of Waterloo in Canada that had that program, which is, I really think almost every technical education should be taught that way. It was absolutely amazing. So it was a mix of that and a mix of I wanted to work on my logic while still building stuff, and I didn't want something where you needed to memorize a lot. So it's kind of closest to, like, I just wanted to get smarter, right? So it was closest to pure logic kind of in the way that math is, but you also get to build things, and that's something that I really like and I'm very motivated by. So that was, it was a lucky coincidence, I think, that I ended up going into computer science. And my first semester, I liked it so much more than I thought I would. It was like an incredibly pleasant surprise of how intellectually challenging and in how many ways and how like fun it was.
Nice. And at the time, did you try anything related to like building stuff with your hands, like mechanical, electrical engineering, or it was a bit too early at the time?
Um, a tiny bit on the electrical side, definitely not mechanical. My dad is an electrical engineer and can fix anything. I am not nearly as good. Maybe I don't think I have a hope to ever be. But yeah, I was on like the robotics team in high school, so I got a little bit of exposure, but definitely more to the computer science, and kind of I came at it from like the math side. Also, really really loved chemistry.
Oh, nice. Got it.
So if mixing two things together to explode counts as doing things with my hands, totally.
Nice. Awesome. So, but computer science was your, like, would you say that was your main passion at the time?
During university and afterwards, yes. During high school, I enjoyed a lot of things. I don't think I had like a main passion in kind of the way that I do now.
I'm actually curious because where I come, in Kyrgyzstan, one thing that usually happens, when you study computer science in colleges, there's like big difference in terms of like gender balance. So just curious what it was like for you when you were just starting out.
Oh yeah, like same thing. I think I can't remember the exact statistics, somewhere in the like 15-20% female, I would say. So a really, really similar. But I don't know. I chose shop over home ec in like middle school, and I was also the only girl there. So it was like, I think I had like more traditionally male interests in a bunch of things. So I don't think it was like a huge shock to me personally, but it's definitely a minority.
Okay, cool. But did it affect in any way? Did it influence in a serious way?
Probably not. For me specifically, right? Like I can absolutely see how it would be for a lot of people, but for me personally, there was like some annoying questions at the beginning. People were like, "Oh, are you here because you're a woman or because you deserve to be here?" Because there was maybe, I'm not sure if my university did it. There was some university that would lower the bar for women. And so there was a lot of questions of like, well, were you one of those or do you deserve to be there? But, by second year, you do really well and nobody asks anymore. So I think there wasn't much, there wasn't much of that as far as like, I never experienced any like serious workplace discrimination or anything like that. So I think I ended up in like, from the beginning of my co-ops, I ended up in some pretty good companies. And so I think I was, there weren't as many role models as maybe I would like, but in general, I don't think I was greatly affected by the gender balance.
Do you have any role models at the time?
I think a lot of small ones for like various things, but I don't think any like, not in the sense that it's usually used.
Got it. Okay, cool. Yeah, and you mentioned the educational system was amazing. Can you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, the interchange of like school and work was awesome, right? So first of all, you graduate with basically no debt, which is great if you're trying to pay for it yourself, right? The amount of like work experience that you get. So it takes you 5 years to graduate instead of 4, but you graduate with 2 years of experience. You don't have any summers or vacations, but you get to try a whole bunch of different things. And so it was, it was just really great in that, I worked at 6 different companies before I graduated. You really get to see how different companies are built and like what, like sometimes what management structures work and like what teams, you kind of, when you're on like a rock star team, it, and then you kind of wonder why is that true in one place and not the other one, right? So there's lots and lots of stuff around that, and also about continuing motivation, right? Because when you're in school, you're learning faster than you do on the job, typically, with like a small number of exceptions. And so by the time you're done your school semester, you're absolutely exhausted, and then you go to work and 40 hours a week seems great. But by the end of work, you're like, okay, I'm not learning as fast as I want to be learning. And then you're really motivated for the next school semester. It's pretty tricky because you're like applying for jobs. Like I think my first time I sent out like 100 CVs and got like 6 interviews. So there's like a lot of like extra work, but it's absolutely worth it. And you get to try a bunch of like really different things. So it's, I seriously think Canada supports it a little bit by giving subsidies to companies that employ interns. But it's absolutely invaluable.
And can you clarify? So you graduate with no debt because it's all got like is it public college, public university, or?
So there's no private universities in Canada. Everything is kind of public, but you still have to pay decent amounts of money for it, because you get paid for your internships typically, even if it's not a lot at the beginning. And so 4 months you study, 4 months you work. During the 4 months you work, you kind of make enough to make up for your next semester. And so because you're like alternating studying and working, you both get a lot of experience. You pick much better courses, like you understand why they're teaching the courses that they're teaching because you maybe ran into this problem in the workplace already. So it's sort of the switching of academic and applied is really great.
Interesting, yeah. And I'm actually surprised you had to apply to like 100 companies because sometimes if you're from like Central Asia, Eastern Europe, that the region we're focusing on right now, it's kind of more predictable because there aren't many famous companies or universities globally. So if you're really smart but you didn't get a chance to work, study at one of those or work on one of those, then it's hard from the resume standpoint. Mm-hmm. I'm surprised you had to go that through, even though you studied like at a top college in North America.
Yeah, it's because the first time you start doing work, you've only had 4 months of schooling. And it was, right, so at that particular case, you're you're maybe not worth like the amount that you can bring to the company versus the like management that they have to put into you might be part of that reason. The other thing is it was still kind of during the times that was like past the dot-com crash. And so just the number of available jobs and, you know, low cost qualified people were just much more available. And so I think for the folks that did this program like 5 or 10 years after I did would have had a very different experience. At the same time, like, you know, a lot of the smart kids, like you don't get rejections until much past you graduate university. And so having like kind of that experience of trying for something which you may or may not be qualified for and getting lots and lots of rejections and like dealing with it and trying some more is like not a bad lesson to learn either.
Yeah, no, I think it's super important to get a lot of rejections. And was it the same experience for your, you know, classmates?
Yeah, I think all of us that started around that time for the first internships just really had to send out lots of CVs. Like by your second internship, you send out 20 and you get 5 interviews. By your third internships, you send out 5 and you get 5 interviews. So it like, as you get more experience and as you become more valuable and as the economy was recovering, it was like a very, very different experience. But it's the same kind of thing as like, you know, you read like hundreds of job postings and decide what you want to try and what you want to learn that semester and kind of apply for those. Of course, a lot of people were, you know, mostly applying for the top companies.
Yeah. And at the time, did you already know you're passionate about carbon emissions or not yet? Like how?
No, I lived in Canada. Global warming sounded great.
Sorry, what?
I lived in Canada. Global warming sounded great. And I like didn't know much more about it. I think global warming, by the way, is a super high marketing failure because it's not, I mean, it's not just about the warming, but like I think it trivializes what happens a little bit. But no, I kind of didn't know what the big deal was.
Yeah. And so can you tell us the journey to Google? So why did you pick Google? Again, I learned that everyone has different reasons. So can you tell me what your reasons were and how you joined? Because that's where we met. I kind of know a lot more after that, but I want to know how it led to it.
Yeah. So I did a master's in distributed systems. And during that master's, I went to like my first conference and I met a guy named John Wilkes, who is like a really amazing distributed research or distributed system scientist. And he was working at Google and he was looking for an intern. And so it was like exactly in my research area and I got to work with him and it was amazing. So this was like still before I had my climate addiction. And then afterwards, like maybe about half a year later, is when I got super interested in climate change. And because I'd already been through the Google system once as an intern, going in again as an intern because I was still enrolled, was pretty easy to say, hey, I really want to be part of Google.org. Google.org is working on, you know, there's a small team that has a couple of engineering projects that are working on climate change. And so that was my first before we met to the mix of like applying my computer science skills to climate change. And so I went and like had an internship there, went and backpacked around South America for a year and then came back and started full time in roughly the same group. I interviewed with a couple of other companies that were kind of at that intersection of climate change and computer science. But at the time, there was one particular project at Google that I couldn't not work on that.
Nice. Is it public? Was it public?
Nope, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know how it goes.
Yep.
Yeah, and do you remember actually how this conversion started from engineer to Energineer? Like, is there like a paper that you read or, you know, somebody you talked to? Like, was there like last straw, not last straw, but you know, one big moment? Or
no, I got you. There totally was. And I think that's like a weird, I think for a lot of people that I've talked to, this happened gradually, but for me it didn't. It was a 4-page article in Scientific American about ocean acidification. It like I went from like, what's the big deal to like, oh my God, I don't think I can work on anything that's not that. And I sort of haven't since then. It was I mean, for me, there's definitely the human effects are really, really, really important, right? No question about that. California is currently on fire, therefore I can't open a window here. So don't get me wrong, like I really feel for that. The thing that really pivoted me into it, and there was another guy named Eric Chauvin, maybe, a book called Sustaining Life. That was like a thing that probably primed me to be particularly receptive to that article. That was I believe he's a medical researcher that pointed out how important biodiversity is to human life, and how that biodiversity is being very seriously threatened right now. So there was that, that article was outlining that there's a chance of mass extinctions, like 70% or more of species extinct in the ocean, and that was I was like, it's not for certain, of course, right? Like all of this is unprecedented. So, but the modeling of that was so influential that I thought, hey, even if there's like a 50% chance that this happens, even if there's a 20% chance that this happens, like that's bad enough compared to all the other jobs that I could be getting or all the other things that I could be working on, like seem to kind of pale in comparison. Which is not to say that there's not other very, very important things to work on, but that one just struck me, and been working on that ever since.
Yeah, that's where I wish everyone was kind of like you, right? It's very logical and rational, right? You get new data and you adapt your motivations, and you adapt your whole life to it, right? But I think for most people, if it's bad news, you try to ignore it, right? And that's one big problem with climate change. It's like, but you also feel like you could affect it, right? It's not like you thought, oh, that's probably too hard. Because a lot of people, they know it's bad, but they try not to think about it because they think, oh, what can I do? Like as this, small little person, I'm just gonna go about my life. No,
yeah. I'm somewhere between optimistic and stubborn. So I think there is some the right level of delusion that I believe that I can do anything, but it's only with the delusion that somebody actually manages to do things. So I'm at the time, I don't think that I even had enough knowledge to know like what can I or what can't I do. It was just like, hey, this is important to work on. So it was a little bit decoupled from anything like confidence or optimism or anything like that. It just was like, hey, here's this outcome that could happen that I don't want to happen. Like I really, really don't want to happen. I've always had a lot of appreciation for nature. I think my parents took me camping and berry and mushroom picking when I was like before I could walk. So that's always been, a particularly strong connection, and the threat of losing some fraction of that, like, of losing like species in the oceans we haven't seen yet, right? Like anytime we go below like 40 meters, we discover a pile of new species, right? There's just a lot of stuff in ecology that we like don't know, we don't understand. Maybe it's integral to our life, maybe it isn't. Like to me, it's just really beautiful, and then like burning it just seems like it seems like given all the money that we as a society put towards various things, including $15 cocktails in San Francisco, right? Like the thought of putting some amount of the luxury effort into this seems absolutely obvious, right? And because my parents got me to a place where I can have jobs that earn me money and give me some savings to work on slightly higher risk things, it was I decided to take that luxury and use it towards this end.
Amazing. And I think appreciation of nature, I think, is a huge topic, right? Because if people value that, that's going to move the needle. If they just don't value nature, then it's harder to argue with, or like debate with those people, right? If like a huge biodiversity loss is okay for them, mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah, some people are more motivated by the human effects that are likely to happen. So I think there's like a few reasons for people to care or not to care. And like, look, there's many other really, really important topics in there. Like if people think that working on human education is a better use of their effort, like that's great too. I just like, for people that have the ability to have their morals and values be aligned with their work, it seems like that's like, if that happens, seems like it's a pretty good win for everyone. And to your previous point around people don't feel like they themselves can do anything. It's interesting, right? Especially, it depends, of course, what your skill set is, but because climate change comes from basically every part of the economy, every skill set that is useful to the economy is also useful to mitigating climate change. So I think there was, like, I also had a similar feeling. I was like, what is my computer science skill set can like, how can that, help with the problem? It seems like solutions are all like chemistry based or like physics based or something like that. That was absolutely incorrect, right? Like, now that I've actually spent like 10 years digging through this, computer science has a huge role to play, as does literally almost every skill set, because it's about changing how we do things, and it's just everything you need for a normal kind of economy. So I think people thinking that they can't do anything is incorrect. If people think that they can do something but it's not enough, I think we all, like, you don't know till you try, right? I think enough people hit on something. Like, for example, the mitigating of some of these methane sources that we're doing, right? The first thing that we tried around natural sources, we had this hypothesis, then a paper came out that said that our impact was likely to be smaller, right? There were some scientific uncertainties around there, and they decided it was probably going to be on the lower end of what we were thinking. And so I was, sulking in a cafe somewhere, and a friend of mine comes by and says, look, like, fine, your lower impact, if you took it as the average footprint of a person, what is your lower impact? Like how many people's offsets or how many people's footprint is it going to nullify? And I'm like, about 7 million. To which he said, well, I hope we all get to like sit around and solve that our impact is only 7 million people's worth of an average footprint.
Wait, can you explain that 7 million number?
Yeah, sorry. The first business model that we tried, at first it looked like we might have a shot at mitigating 1% of global emissions. There was a scientific paper that came out, because this is on like natural sources, which reduced some of the likelihood to something closer to, let's say, 0.1% of global human emissions, which is, if you think of it from like a average person footprint, that turns out to be 7 million people. So like, sometimes some of these ideas, this is one simple idea, right? And like that one company can achieve in like, 5 to 10 years, hopefully. And so I think there's enough of these pieces that are like the 0.1% of the whole problem, which doesn't sound like much, but it's actually, if you think about it as far as like the number of people that, can now live a footprint-free life, that becomes a lot higher.
Wow. And do you want to tell...
Multiply everything by 7 billion.
Sorry?
If you think, every time you think of your own impact, just multiply by the number of people.
Yeah, the small percentage is huge, yeah. I think maybe it's easier to talk about the gigatons, because like it sounds bigger, right? If you like offset certain number of tons, right, it feels sometimes like I'm doing it, contributing more. So I was gonna ask, like, do you want to mention a little bit what the first idea was? So I think you had some really exciting things from the beginning. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I have a tendency of wanting to be in pretty empty areas, right? So, if there's not like as opposed to a crowded area, right? So something that has pretty nobody's working at. And the first thing when we started Frost Methane was about mitigating natural methane sources. So nobody has ever done that before. The science there's great scientists that are working on it, but there's still a lot of unknowns, especially in the Arctic. But there was like an article in the Siberian Times. So again, I swear this is true.
Which you always read every morning with your coffee.
Hey, it's actually
it's being a proper Russian.
They have some great they have some really great kind of like science and archaeology section, just saying. But there was basically, and like I think in 2014 was the first time that people have seen these like large methane bubbles forming in the Arctic and exploding. Actually not exploding from pressure. I don't think there's any combustion in it. So whatever the correct term for that is. But basically large hills that are forming. I did a little back of the envelope of like, it was about, the article that I saw was saying that 7,000 of them had popped up in the Yamal Peninsula. I think only 2 or 3 of those have actually popped, but essentially just doing the back of the envelope, if that 7,000 number is accurate, then it's 0.5% emissions from this tiny, tiny, tiny peninsula in Siberia, right? And so my question was, oh my God, why are there concentrated methane emissions coming from the Arctic? The Arctic was supposed to be like, all the permafrost sphere was supposed to be a slow rot of like ancient vegetation. And here we have a very concentrated emissions, right? So this is something that we don't understand very well. There's hypothesis around, is this methane hydrides that are losing their solid form, or is this pockets of natural gas that used to be trapped below the permafrost that now go through, or maybe this is a process that was always happening and we're just now noticing it. Like, there's lots and lots of scientific unknowns. But my thought was, hey, this is concentrated methane. There's an easy thing you can do to concentrated methane to mitigate it, which is turn it into CO2, also known as burning. So methane is 28 times more potent than CO2. So when you burn it, you basically reduce that amount, and the heat that you get from the burning reaction is pretty negligible compared to what the methane would have captured as heat in the atmosphere. And so the thought, and then as far as monetization, because, we both used to work at Google, and Google offsets its emissions, I knew about carbon offset markets because I was buddies with the woman whose job it was to purchase carbon offsets. So I knew how she was thinking about what's a high value, like an offset that we know for sure mitigates the footprint that we're looking for, right? What's the additionality and the permanence and kind of the way that carbon offset purchasers thinks about it. And so right away it clicked for me that there's a business model here, because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and this is large amounts of it in one place, meaning that the cost to mitigate this could be very, very small compared to other things that are in the market because of this large methane multiplier. And so that was the first idea, was like, okay, there's these concentrated methane sources. Let's turn all of those into CO2. And of course, these are large exploding hills, so you would need some robotic things. So that idea was even was put on the back burner even before we formed the company. And we went with sources that are less explosive in nature, but still concentrated methane vents, essentially. So some in mud volcanoes, some in permafrost vents. There's various other versions of that in less exotic places than the Arctic. But our first installation was in the Arctic. This, unfortunately, is not the Arctic.
This is what?
No, this is the Himalayas. That's not the Arctic.
Got it. Did you take that picture?
Yeah.
Awesome. So I was gonna actually, now that I think of your career, I think so much of your career actually was kind of leading up to it, because you worked on a lot of cool projects at Google X, a lot of which we cannot talk about. But maybe can you talk about how your some of your projects or some of your experience at Google and Google X helped you leading up to this company?
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of the work that I did was in like the electric grid. And actually after Google, I went to work on off-grid electrification in like sub-Saharan Africa with the Zola Electric. So there was definitely a lot of like variety. But at Google, quite a few things. So first of all, like even finding out about the carbon offset markets, meeting a huge number of people that were experts in the various parts of the climate problem. So the Earth Engine team, does an amazing job and has outreach to lots of academics. So anytime, and I was curious about a lot of things, right? But like every time I had a particular questions, I could like go to those guys. They would say like, who's the relevant academic, whose stuff I could read. There was also this, I love the Eng misc list. It was the sort of thing where I could be like, hey, but why is it that we can't capture methane and nitrous oxide out of the air? Like, here's kind of what I think about where the energy is needed to push stuff through a membrane versus what happens in the membrane. So I remember sending that one out, was like one of my first one, and getting a bunch of physicists to comment on my crazy ideas, which was pretty great. There was like a thing within Google that I never, I pitched, like it never got started, but that was also methane related, where a guy that used to work at NASA was helping me with figuring out, also through this like random NGMISC list, was helping me figure out like what's the detection limit of methane sensors, which now is coming very much in handy. So between that and the kind of data center sustainability teams, and Google.org had climate initiatives, and Google X had initiatives, and Google Energy had initiatives, the how complete my understanding is in climate compared to what it would have been had I not been there is very, very different. Of course, like definitely now, especially around like fundraising and all of that, having been at Google definitely gives like a little bit of a stamp of approval, especially not having gone to a US university. So that definitely doesn't hurt either. But yeah, I met so many amazing people there. And in fairness, two of the projects that I worked on at Google X, are now spun up companies and are making a difference in the world. So that's like, Dandelion and Malta. So that's like a huge,
amazing. Yeah, that's awesome. Not for everyone. Not all projects spin out and become public. But that explains to me a lot, because again, I really meant it when I was saying it in the introduction. A lot of people knew you as like this go-to person, which I can call an expert, but like a go-to person for carbon emissions. I feel like you were really leveraging Google's, some of the Google's biggest strength, right? Is have all these nerds who are really passionate about all these topics, and it's a very open culture where you can just email this huge mailing list and people actually read it and reply, or you can email like up to the CEO. CEO, sometimes could be busy, but like at the VP level, definitely I get many replies, even when I was like at the bottom of the hierarchy. So it sounds like that's what helped you kind of like learn so much so quickly, and also like that's how I feel like now I realize that's how people know you in the very different parts of the company. Cool. And can you tell us about Malta and Dandelion? These were two of my favorite projects at Google X. I'm so happy they spun out. I love the teams. Can you tell us a little bit more about them?
Totally. And I was, for complete clarity, I was absolutely not the lead of them. I was just helping out. So on Malta, basically the idea is, can we store, everybody knows, now we have very cheap intermittent renewables, but the reason that we still have a lot of fossil fuels is that renewables, wind blows whenever it wants to, sun shines also at kind of particular times, but not at others. So really the key there is, if we can make storage or flexible demand or really long transmission lines very, very cheap, then we can have a more what's called firm resource from something that's pretty intermittent and sometimes very hard to predict in the case of wind. I kite surf, trust me, I'm very upset that wind cannot be predicted better. So the idea of like, okay, well, how can we make cheap storage, right? Like electrochemical batteries have certain limitations. Pumped hydro has geographical limitations. And Malta was this really clever idea of, not my clever idea, just that idea I was helping out on, that basically you can store energy and heat in ways that don't have the same geographic limitations and don't have the same cost limitation as what you see in like electrochemical batteries. And, the question is really like, can you have this, store electricity into heat and then heat back into electricity when you need it? And can you do this pretty cheap? And how like, and part of the way that you do it so cheaply is your fluid there is like molten salt, right? Where you push more heat and pull heat out of that.
Sorry, can you just clarify what the fluid is? I think maybe people couldn't hear.
The place where you store that heat is in molten salt.
Molten salt.
Yeah, and molten salt is very, very, very cheap. And so if you need more hours of storage, you just like pop an extra tank of molten salt, which is much easier than, putting in an extra lithium ion battery bank. And so that's kind of the basic idea, was like, particularly for long-term storage, heat has a lot of benefits over, let's say, lithium ion or lead acid.
So where is the, again, only if it's public information, what are good places for this? Like where, maybe can you tell us where they deployed, or if I'm assuming it's not perfect for all geographies, but it's good for some. And can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so this the nice thing about this method is that it doesn't have a geographic limitations in the same way that, let's say, pumped hydro does, right? So pumped hydro is when you bring water up the hill when you have excess electricity, and then when you need electricity, you let water flow down the hill and pass it through a turbine. So for example, so things like that requires mountains of a large height differential.
I'm glad you have the mountain. It's so useful in the background.
With molten salt, you don't have that issue, right? And so in some cases, if you have a cheaper storage method, or if you have, so for example, if you have pumped hydro with the right parameters, it's really about as cheap as storage can go right now. So in those places, you probably don't want to deploy the molten salt solution. But in places where you don't happen to have the Himalayas, molten salt solutions are, we'll see. This is still like in development. But this is something that might be very helpful. And what you really want is, it's most useful in areas that have large wind and solar penetration and not much dispatchable electricity, right? So let's say geothermal is much more dispatchable, or, natural gas plants single cycle natural gas plants are very dispatchable. So in those areas, if you have a lot of dispatchables, not as useful. If you don't have many dispatchables and you have a lot of intermittent renewables, then these storage solutions are great.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm so happy they are doing this. And can you tell us about the Dandelion?
Yeah. So Dandelion is basically heating and cooling of houses with geothermal energy instead of combusting methane, right? Combusting natural gas is kind of the typical, or I believe in the areas the Dandelion is deployed, fuel oils. And so the idea is pretty simple. The ground is at a temperature year round of whatever is the average air temperature. So if you're experiencing, excuse me for the Celsius, but that's still what I think is. So if you're experiencing...
We'll beep it.
So if you're experiencing -10 outside, the ground just a few meters below your house is at 10-15 Celsius, right? And so you can imagine that if you had a way of moving the heat around from the ground into your house, and you can concentrate it, your house doesn't need to be that average temperature. We can get it to 20-25 Celsius, whatever it is you like. That pumping of the heat is much more efficient than creating the heat, right, by combusting something. And so the innovation in Dandelion, well, there were several innovations in Dandelion. So one is the kind of business innovation of doing lots of houses nearby at the same time, which just really drops the cost, like standardizing on some of the equipment, and the drilling, right? Being able to really efficiently access that heat in the ground. So it sort of brought some of the oil and gas drilling innovations into this kind of much cleaner technology. So that was, and Dandelion is doing amazing. So first of all, Kathy Cooper, who is the lead of the project, is fantastic.
Huge respect for Kathy. Yeah, huge respect. Yeah.
Thousands and thousands of houses now with a super long waiting list. As far as I know, all over the U.S., but I think they're specifically concentrated around New York.
Yeah, Kathy for me seems like also one of these people who, was living about her life and then learned about seriousness of climate change and dropped what she was doing and then just decided to work on it because that's the most important thing to work on, by many means. So yeah, it's just amazing to meet people like that who, dedicate their career to humanity's, biggest problems. I'm so happy Dandelion is doing well. It just makes me very happy.
Yeah, they're doing absolutely amazing. That's really super fast deployment across thousands of sites at least.
Yeah, that's really cool. I want to come back a little bit to one thing that you said is about, you said every skill set is needed, because that resonated with me a little bit. Because for me also climate change was something somebody else is going to address because I don't have the skills. I love computer science, but I was bad in physics, chemistry, biology, all that. Somehow I love it now. But yeah, for me, it was kind of I'm bad at this, so I should not get involved. But I just really like the thought that it's such a big, complex problem that any skill set is really needed and can be helpful. Can you talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so I'm going to take your example for computer science because obviously that's the one that I've thought the most about, but I'm happy to do it for like marketing or business or whatever it is you want. But like for just like computer science, like there is tons of control problems that where you don't need to know the chemistry, right? Like somebody else is developing a more dense battery or like, you know, better round trip efficiencies or whatever. Like you still need a controller for it. You still need to figure out where on the grid that battery is going to make the most money, right? Because like the grid for computer scientists and mathematicians out there, right? Like the grid is actually a very, very classical set of graph problems, right? You've got, you know, a bunch of transmission constraints. Transmission constraints really matter. You've got some sources, you've got some sinks. It is classical, but extremely large and extremely complicated graph problem. And so there's just so many places there as far as like optimal dispatch. You know, the rules are changing all the time, and really you should, you know, there's lots of new regulations around flexible demand that are popping up all the time, right? So anything like you name it, like where to site the best wind and solar sites. Like we've kind of figured this out for when the wind blows the most, but when does the wind blow the most at the time that the electric grid needs it the most? Like that problem isn't solved yet. Same thing in like better agriculture, right? Like better agriculture is very quickly becoming a data problem, right? Of how do you get more while improving the soil, while potentially reducing like nitrous oxide emissions from over fertilizer or flooding from kind of one of the typical rice growing patterns. So I think there is like, you know, not to mention everything you can do with satellite data right now, right? Like as you know, folks like Planet and various satellites that are being launched by like ESA and NASA are like exploding. Like we now have so much visibility into any supply chain optimization process you want, any like what's happening on the ground versus what the models are saying, like any high level like optimization, monitoring where deforestation is happening. Again, like you can do now things that you couldn't have done before. So I feel like with the really, really quick pace of technology, the amount of opportunities in really significant chunks of climate change mitigations are like, I think I probably have a list of like hundreds of these things where a computer science skill set is relevant.
Oh, that's awesome. Yes, we might have another talk about this particular topic, which I think is really, really important. And yeah, let me move on to a couple of other things. Yeah, I have more questions which are non-company related, but maybe can you tell us more about the company first, and then we can cover the hobbies and stuff like that later.
Yeah, so we mitigate concentrated methane emissions. We have a hypothesis around natural sites that is a little bit on the back burner, especially in the Arctic things. But we're also working with methane from coal mines. So that's about 2% of global human emissions from the methane that is a byproduct of the mining, not burning the coal itself. That's like additional. So that's kind of our main focus right this moment is on the methane that's coming from those sites. And very similar ideas, we can figure out how to concentrate it and then flare it, ideally using it for productive uses, but also to sell carbon offsets. And we built a bunch of things for that. But one of the things that I was a little bit surprised how much traction is getting is we built a really low-cost monitoring system for our flares. And we've actually now been talking with oil and gas that might be interested in using that to monitor their flares because it's much lower cost. Like it's more than 10 times cheaper than anything off the market. And so I think that there's kind of an interesting opportunity now around how can we use the technology we've already built at a couple of other places that also have concentrated methane leaks and kind of monitoring needs.
Awesome. That's super fascinating. And just a very dumb question from me. So burning methane immediately sounded like counter-intuitive for me. Like, were there any other options considered, or like freezing or something like that? Again, questions from somebody who knows very little about this area.
No, that's a great question, and I think a lot of I think that's a question we get like a lot, even for people that have worked a lot in climate change. So, just as like a couple of numbers, right? Burning it is incredibly cheap from a device perspective and mitigates 96% of the warming effect. So basically, whenever we have the choice of do we scale this thing faster, do we solve like 96% of the problem for like 10% of the cost, or do we solve 100 of it for like, 9 times as much, which is roughly what it would end up costing. We much rather do the imperfect solution and then scale really quickly, and then figuring out from having a large number of sites, figuring out what we could do better at each one. But the other things that we've considered is, of course, generating electricity from it and transmitting it to whatever is the closest human need for electricity. As you can imagine, transmission lines are incredibly expensive to build, and so you need to be very, very close to existing transmission lines, and you need to have large enough source where building that transmission line matters. The economics for delivering it to pipelines are significantly worse because you're trucking it around as opposed to putting a generator and running a wire. And so that's something that we've discarded pretty quickly. And then the other stuff that we've really tried exploring is can we bring the need for energy to the site as opposed to bring the energy that can be generated at the site to wherever it's needed. The economics of that are also pretty tricky because if you're asking somebody to move, you need to be significantly below the cost of electricity, which in the US is very cheap. On the industrial scale is below 7 cents a kilowatt hour in most places. So, you need to make sure that your generators and their maintenance and everything can be like paid off despite that. Under some circumstances, I think we could do it, right? We could like take some load off the main grid and put it onto ours, but that remains to be seen. The business model does stand on its own feet pretty easily with just the carbon offset markets, right? That's kind of the straightforward. Our plan is really to use the carbon offset markets to very precisely characterize each source. There is some variability and a lot of unknowns about what each source produces. And so I think for us, using the carbon offset markets to, which has very low capex for our types of projects, to measure while mitigating a large variety of that. And then once we have very precise data on sources and their decline curves and various things like that, we could invite various local businesses to see whether they would be willing to relocate, because then we'll be able to tell them very, very precisely how long this is going to last, which is, these sources that we're tackling are tens to hundreds of years long, so should be okay. But what are the very precise amounts that we can offer, and whether there's any kind of like seasonal variation in that. So I think that's roughly the plan, right? Is kind of do that and then open it up to folks. There's cool things like Mango Materials, which does plastics from methane. They typically are attached to landfills, but I think there's things like that if our sources generate the right volumes and the right gas mixtures, because what we're seeing is not purely methane. There's some nitrogen and trace amounts, like some CO2, a couple of other things. So if those mixtures are correct for their processes, we'd be super happy too. But I think the way this is going to go is get a bunch of sites going and then publish the gas mixtures, the flow rates, the variations, all of that, and see who wants to come.
Wow, amazing.
Also, the one company that wants to come is Bitcoin mining. So that's something that's easy to relocate to a different site, or easier than many of the other to relocate to a different site, and requires lots of energy. Tumim Real is the company that we're working with. We really like them. So hopefully we'll have sites that meet their requirements.
Yeah, I had no idea we're gonna talk about Bitcoin today. Didn't expect it's gonna come up. Yeah.
These guys are very green Bitcoin miners, so they're really interested in taking advantage of what's called stranded energy assets. So energy assets that are a significant amount of energy, but you can't economically transfer them out. And so it would be pretty cool if you could run all of Bitcoin mining off of natural gas that gets flared in the oil and gas world, or flared from us or from landfills, right? There's lots of sources of these stranded asset or stranded energy.
Yeah. And hopefully also blockchain technologies will switch to, I think it was proof of stake and some other less computation intensive. Do you follow that at all?
Very little, only through those guys. So I have very little to say on whether proof of stake will work in practice or has some gameable element.
Yeah, I'm sure somebody in comments can give us an update on that.
Somebody knows.
And
Not me, though.
again, talking to you, I realized how big the market is. Can you tell a little bit about your optimism about carbon markets and how big of an opportunity this is as a business as well? Because you already talked about enormous impact that could have on reducing carbon emissions, but I think the business impact is pretty huge too, right?
Yeah, totally. So I think a lot of people think of voluntary carbon offset markets when they think about carbon markets, which is actually the minority. So for example, companies like Google that say we're going to reduce, we measure our footprint and we're going to buy offsets to match whatever it is that we couldn't reduce in other ways, right? It's really hard to, Google employees fly to business meetings. That's something that's, building an electric airplane is going to take a while, right? This is something that's a little bit outside of their control. So that type of, those types of activities, like you purchase offsets for. That's what's called the voluntary carbon markets, meaning nobody's making you. And that's not the majority. The majority is from compliance markets, right? So California cap and trade and much bigger, the EU ETS, is the idea that a company can emit, a company that's emitting beyond a certain amount needs, let's say, a cement factory, right? Can only emit by regulations a particular amount, right? Now, you're not going to go and rebuild your cement factory tomorrow, right? There's like lots of improvements that take lots of time, and carbon offset markets are really, or cap and trade markets are really important at like setting people on that path. But at the end of the day, if you can't reduce, then you either trade with somebody that managed to reduce or buy offsets, right? And offsets typically trade a couple of dollars cheaper than allowances. And so in California cap and trade, EU ETS, right now there's going to be an extra $2 billion annual market called the CORSIA, which is all airlines will have to offset any increases in their emissions. And again, airlines don't have much of a choice, right? There's like electric airplanes or maybe hydrogen airplanes, although I think it'll go electric, will take quite a long time to emerge and to replace the existing fleet. Air travel grows at 3 to 5% per year. COVID exception, asterisks. And like the typically airplane efficiency across, like on a really good year, like for like whatever new airplanes coming out is going to be like 0.5%. And so I think there's, with the replacements of the fleet that are required, it's pretty negligible, unfortunately. And biofuels for jet fuel, for the full life cycle assessment, it looks a little bit tricky to find something that is really, really low carbon. And so I think that entire market is going to go towards offsets. So that's an extra $2 billion in addition to the $4 billion a year that you have now from the various markets. But at the end of the day, the thing that I really like about carbon offset markets is that it gets a bunch of entrepreneurs to compete for who can mitigate climate change the cheapest. And the cheapest, like, really, really matters, right? Like, I know that the audience for this talk is all over the world. In San Francisco, people are maybe like, oh, I'd pay $15 for my cocktail. Does this matter? And the answer is it absolutely does, because the people that are most disadvantaged are going to get affected the most by whatever the price hikes somewhere down the line happen to be from that. And so I'm a really big fan of using market mechanisms, or at least the idea of using market mechanisms, to get people to compete for the cheapest direct mitigations. For example, if you take something like our idea of like there's these exploding hills in Siberia, we can mitigate the methane that's coming out of that. That's never going to be like a government regulation in the same way that like vehicle efficiency standards are going to be. And so having something that gives a chance to these 0.1% of global warming solutions to like add up, maybe to like overall 10-15%, that I think is absolutely critical. And having the entrepreneurs basically be able to push it rather than have it centrally planned, I think is a really, really good idea, in addition to all the centrally planned regulations around building efficiencies and vehicle efficiencies and so on, right? So I think like basically it is one of the most efficient, like market mechanisms are very efficient in mitigating whatever it is you want to mitigate for these things, not for ones where the original investment and the ongoing investments are decoupled like you do get in buildings. But I think for a lot of things, this is a really good way of getting lots of innovation directed into the right spot. And carbon markets are a little bit of a shorthand, right? Like in practice, if you can find a very cheap climate change mitigation, there's lots of countries that have Paris obligations. And so if you've got a large enough chunk at a low enough cost, there's other ways of monetizing through them. There's low carbon fuel standards. There's various countries that are willing to do large reductions that have different regulations that don't sound like carbon offset markets, but it's a similar idea. And so I think there's like lots of ways of monetizing. If you've got an idea for a large chunk, low cost mitigation, let me know. We'll find a way to monetize it, because this is, at the end of the day, people care. People in governments care. And they're willing to put their money where their mouth is to some extent. Like, beyond, right now we're going to be capped at 6 billion a year for a little bit for specifically these carbon offset markets, but the trajectory is already set to grow, both on the, 3 to 5% growth on the CORSIA markets, 5% growth in price on the California market. Like all of that is already, those regulations have already been passed.
Love it. No, love it. I'm getting excited about the markets as well. That's where they could really help out. Awesome. I was gonna switch to some other more personal topics. One is slightly less personal. Is you started a community related to climate change in the Bay Area, which I'm a proud member of, and it's a community where you have talks on a very wide variety of topics, and all related to mitigating climate change, mainly using technology. And that's where I meet people who, work on nuclear fusion or artificial, lab-grown meat and agriculture robotics. It's a pretty amazing community to be a part of, to be honest. And it has a fun name and some fun traditions. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's called the Witnesses of Climatology. We still run it through Facebook and a mailing list. We haven't, we're not cool enough to be on TikTok or Slack or whatever. But the basic idea was that it's a little bit of a hat tip to religions that I think have interesting methods of getting people to come around tragedies of the common sort of issues. And so we did a little bit of like parodies on various holidays. So we have Fossil Fuel Independence Day, where we have a solar barbecue instead of a coal barbecue. Glacier Memorial Day, where we watch Chasing Ice and eat slightly melted ice cream. Gets more melted every year. Reverse Christmas, where we plant a tree instead of cutting one down. One of the projects that we did that was actually Tilek's idea was the Amazon browser plugin. So when you go to Amazon.com, it instead shows you photos of the Amazon with, interesting nature facts. So that's been pretty fun. But yeah, no, it's. I think the thing that I'm most proud of in that community is the absolutely fantastic collection of people that. I don't know. I don't think I've ever met anybody that I didn't have something significant to learn from. So that's been amazing. And now with COVID, it's actually online, so that's entirely accessible from other places. And so we try to bring in speakers not strictly from the Bay Area, or we had a Colorado chapter that was starting right before the lockdown. So now this is like the upside about this whole thing is that now this is much more accessible. But essentially, we try to do both projects and bring in speakers from very different areas of climate change. So anywhere from like green roofs to like industrial, like clean cement, to planting trees with drones. Like there's kind of a large set of things. So we don't just talk about solar and wind. Don't get me wrong. There's very interesting topics in solar and wind, but we talk about the full spectrum of it. And the hope is that people will at some point hear about a problem and be like, oh, I know how to solve this. And then, hopefully solve that piece of the puzzle.
I think one of your strengths really is bringing fun to the serious issue. Most of the times people avoid it. But again, like I was at one of those events eating ice cream, discussing like melting glaciers. It's like if the event was just about melting, glaciers, it would be very different. But when you have to eat ice cream, it's a whole different story.
Climate change could definitely use a little bit of humor. I think, all of us in the Eastern Bloc have a little bit of a love for dark humor and potentially bad puns. Remember the first time we had the generating ritual at Ritual Coffee on Valencia Street? That was, I think, kind of how the entire thing was getting started. But yeah, I think it's definitely not a doom and gloom kind of group. I think everybody there is very, very solutions oriented. So like, let's hear about these interesting problems and sometimes not problems, right? We've had some biodiversity talks as well, but let's hear about these issues and then kind of figure out what we can do about them or what somebody can do about them. And maybe that somebody is you and maybe it's not.
Yes, please, everyone who's listening, I highly recommend joining. Now it's online. It's an amazing group of technology scientists and very diverse people. Really, really proud to be a part of. I have a couple of questions which are more personal.
We love having you there. I think everybody that's met you there has been like, this guy, how do I get in touch with him?
Thank you. I'm glad we built a Chrome. You guys built a Chrome extension as an idea. I also recommend to install it. We'll add links in the description. And just a couple of things. And one thing about yourself personally is whenever some example from like popular culture comes up, or like a movie or an actor, you have no idea what it is. Oftentimes, because you didn't really watch TV or like Netflix. I don't know if it changed, but you spent your time reading scientific journals and papers.
Yes, I am a nerd and proud of it.
What's your favorite scientific journal?
I mean, Scientific American is like the right level for me specifically. I find like Science or Nature typically require too much specialized knowledge that I don't have. And Scientific American is kind of meant for people that don't have a background in a particular thing, but are generally scientific. The one part of Scientific American which I don't like is the opinion pieces and anything in computer science, because in computer science I have too much context. And so it's less interesting, but anything on the biology, physics, chemistry, environment, like any of those things, I think their editors are amazing. The curation is great. Like, no matter how much I know about a field, I always learn more, with the exception of computer science, where it's like, that's less of a good fit for me, but they almost don't have any articles on that. So yeah, but Scientific American is something that like I still 10 years later read religiously, and I definitely credit some of that with me getting into climate change. Maybe one day I'll write a piece for them. That would be like a perfect full circle.
Yeah, I mean, you can write a piece about what software engineers or computer scientists could do for climate change. You are very well positioned to write it, I think.
I think you're totally right. I think that's absolutely the one.
Yeah. No, you actually, like, I didn't really know about it. Maybe I just heard the name, but you actually kind of inspired me to read it. And once in a while now I read it, and I love that it's very scientific, it's very rational, but also it tries to popularize it. And it's very hard to strike this balance, right? It's like sometimes you can dumb it down a little bit too far. So I'm glad you mentioned it. And you also briefly mentioned kite surfing. I was actually curious, did that play a role? So when you read this paper about ocean acidification, at the time, did you have like a special appreciation for ocean because of kite surfing, or you started kite surfing later? Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, I think I started kite surfing when I came to the Bay Area the first time. So when I was still like distributed systems kind of work. I think it definitely gives me a better understanding of what you can do with wind. Right, I think the guys that started Makani Power were kite surfers and windsurfers, so some understanding of how to harness the power of the wind in this different way with a kite rather than a fixed wind turbine. I think that that sinks in instinctively in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise. I think using kite, like you know, sailing for propulsion, very, very old idea, just makes a lot more sense, and you can like viscerally feel the limitations of it. But I think the biodiversity appreciation is probably a little bit less, with the exceptions of like when I accidentally kite right near a whale or a dolphin or something like that. That's definitely an amazing experience. But I don't know that influenced me getting into climate change. I think it just got me to understand a fraction of climate change better, because like I can see how the winds are changing kind of during the time that I've been working on it, and how the winds change whenever there's fires and that kind of stuff. So I think a little bit better understanding of weather patterns in general.
Awesome. No, it's fascinating. No, I hope to pick it up as a hobby, or at least to try it at some point. I tried kiting and I tried surfing. They were both extremely difficult for me, and I cannot imagine how difficult it's doing both at the same time.
Kite surfing is easier than surfing, actually. I think it's surfing is a very particular technique. I think kite surfing is it's a little more intimidating in some sense because it's got more gear, but I think it's generally easier to get into, or easier to get good at.
Got it. So if you have any questions about getting into kite surfing.
Yeah, and anybody there that's working on weather prediction, I have a special request to like have better wind predictions. I mean, it's going to help with optimizing airplane routes. It's going to help with like understanding when the wind is going to cut out from a production standpoint, where to place wind farms, and when I should drive to the beach. All equally important.
Yeah, we definitely should have another talk about all of the ideas you have for things to do. And I'm very excited about the progress of your business, and in terms of like partnerships, and I think you have an amazing team and you have amazing backers. Do you want to mention lastly, maybe to talk a little bit about your team and your investors?
Sure. Yeah. So the team is absolutely amazing, right? We've got folks that are, I aim to be the least intelligent person on whatever team I'm at, and in this case I'm succeeding. We've got Elizabeth Hillstrom that works with us as a mechanical engineer, and she is absolutely brilliant. She was working in the nuclear industry before that, and like is on the board of an Alaskan education nonprofit, and is super competent in the field, super confident in the lab and in machining. We've got folks on the electrical side, Edwin, that was one of the first engineers at SpaceX, and build an underwater, the life support for a 3-seater submarine, which I believe now operates in the Maldives, and has, as we call it, an addiction to building things. It's kind of amazing. I think he built an electric bicycle when he was 9, and was on Revenge of the Nerd show with Jeff Bezos, who was I got this bookstore, seems like people are okay with buying book online because we've got a better selection, anyways. Then on the electrical side as well, we've got Lachlan Barker, who spent 3 seasons in Antarctica. We've got Ethan Chalev that built the original mechanical design that was also nuclear and rocketry industry. And then we've got Derek that helps out with operations, and we've got Megan that has experience in building businesses. And so we're not a fully technical team. So that's and lots of people that have been helping out in various ways along the way, both in partnerships and in various support and advice. So we've been just incredibly fortunate to have such a high talent team. And then on the investor side, the Mulago Foundation is amazing. That was the first people that believed in us, which is I don't think we could have gotten luckier with them. The Mulago Foundation has 2 kind of programs, right? One is any improvements in the developing world, with the most rigorous impact metrics that I have ever seen. And then they're also, as of 5 or 6 years ago, they're also really interested in climate change and conservation, partially because it's going to affect the global poor the most. And that's an incredibly unfair situations in that they're the least responsible for it. So I think that's the kind of really heartbreaking situations that that they've observed. Having a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa. And then Lowercarbon Capital, also known as Lowercase Capital, are also incredibly amazing. There was our first large check-in, and they're absolutely fantastic, really, really dedicated to things that are really good for the planet and have large, sizable, unique climate mitigation, but also have the potential to grow into a really large business. Because, the bigger our margins are, the more we're going to get to do to implement on our very large number of other methane-related ideas. And so I think the focus on growth and profits and margins and all of that is exactly the right thing to do, whether you want a lot of money or whether you want a lot of impact. There's some exceptions to that, right? Lots of really great nonprofits doing amazing work in this space. But somewhere in the chain, especially when we're talking about the entire economy, this is a profit-driven kind of world. And so at least at this point in time, until we have, we're better at taking externalities into account, having something that grows really, really fast is kind of where I would like to make my contributions until I'm out of the ideas that can make contributions in that way, and then I'll find other ways.
Super, super exciting. And where are you actually in terms of fundraising?
We're about to open our seed round. So so in a few weeks, we've got a bunch committed, but we are looking for value-aligned investors. We're always looking for value-aligned people, right? Like investors, partners, anybody that is really excited about mitigating concentrated methane emissions. Send us a line. There is always, or different priorities, but there's always things that we can work on. So we're going to open the seed round probably in a couple of weeks.
Awesome. And how would you like the people to get in touch with you?
LinkedIn is actually really, really good. When I was at Google, I did not understand the purpose of LinkedIn. And now I'm like, oh my God, how does anybody live without it? It's incredibly useful in getting a professional snapshot of a person. And it's been really, really helpful. So LinkedIn is a really good way to go. And then we can take it from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Olya. I was really happy to talk to you. I'm very, very excited about what you do.
Thank you, Tilek. My pleasure.
Bye, everyone.